speaker is David Penney. David was appointed as the first Associate Director of the newly organized Museum Scholarship Group at the NMEI in April 2011, after a long career at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Penney joined the Detroit Institute of Arts in 1980 as curator of Native American art and was promoted to the position of chief curator in 1996, and ultimately served as vice president of exhibitions and collection strategies from 2003 to 2011. Penney's exhibitions include Kate Walking-Stick, an American artist with co-curator Kathleen Nash-Milby, and he has many publications, including Native North American Art, or the Thames and Hudson World Art Series, published in 2004. Please help me welcome David Penney.
Good afternoon. It's my luck of the draw to speak to you right after lunch. If you're flagging, I'll try to stay active. Let me first thank Dr. King, all the staff here at the Gilcrease, my colleagues, Gaylord Torrance and Emma Hansen, for this inviting me to participate in this really interesting event. This is our third or fourth visit down here to Tulsa to look at your splendid collections and to think about publication and exhibition based on these institutions. I'd also like to acknowledge John Stewart, who's been a very wonderful host for us here. And I'm going to focus some of my comments this afternoon on a particular item in his collection, which links up with some research I've been conducting over the past several years. Let me begin this talk by isolating a few themes. First, millions of historic Native items are now cared for by natural history museums, university museums, art museums, historical societies, travel museums, and private collections. And this is a circumstance of the long and difficult histories of settler nation building in relation to the indigenous nations of North America. The separation of these collections from their source communities resulted from violent disruptions of tribal histories. Objects looted in combat, sold or bartered for sustenance, or for some perhaps created and offered in hopeful exchange, as we'll hear about later on in my talk. From my standpoint as a career administrator, I am aware of the enormous expense of effort, time, and treasure involved with the ongoing care of such collections. As the rationale behind this massive accumulation of material culture continues to shift, my concern lies with what I perceive as a declining interest among developing scholarship in researching these collections. No question, the quality of research and the knowledge has grown considerably over the span of my career, but the number of researchers engaged in such work declined among the immediate generation that followed me. There was a lot of work to do, and fewer, it seems, to do it. Secondly, scholarship interest in these collections remains to some degree tied to outdated and misleading distinctions between historic collections and modern art. It seems to me that this distinction grows out of a legacy of anthropological theorizing generations ago that generated now obsolete models of culture change that we know today as acculturation, assimilation, syncretism, and their most recent retooling, hybridity. As historians and art historians, we seek to unite in fine-grained and seamless detail the false polarities of tradition and modernism. But to do so requires some focus on my first point, the research of the collections that fill this artificial and conceptual gap with their undeniable materiality. Thirdly, the different ways that objects connect to people and their social worlds leave traces. Memories, stories, dances, songs, ceremonies, replicas, influences, documents, field notes, letters, invoices, inventories, and catalog records. These traces, this evidence, under the best of circumstances, create a pathway back to the object's origins and tell us something about the journey. Informed by an understanding of the various attachments between objects and the social worlds in which they circulated, here lies our best chance at reconnecting objects in collections to the worlds to which they once belonged. This is the only real justification for the trouble and expense of caring for these collections. without a solid and factual basis for understanding what they are, who made them, and for what, and for whom they are made, the potential for misleading the casual public into conventional and often, frankly, racist frames of reference is too great. A tendency confirmed by a century of museum displays and the general conditions of ignorance that persist often today. So without the research, the collection can tend to work against the interests of Native America's native nations by letting conventional thinking stand unchallenged. What is more, the time is ripe, not least because of proliferation of digitally based research tools and the increasing professionalism of collections care. So let's turn to the subject of this talk. A man named Sayosapa was born in the 1840s and died at Poplar River, his home near the Fort Peck Agency in 1902 or 1903. He was a Yuipi doctor who reinvented himself during a time of great community upheaval into a purveyor of ritual objects and a prolific artist. His creations have been pressed into service in modern museum displays as artistic masterpieces and icons of plain spiritual art, but with no knowledge of who created them or the circumstances of the creation. In fact, most of the objects he made came to be attributed to other, nameless artists of other nations, and even his identity has been long confused with others. There is much remaining to do in terms of researching the artistic biography of Sayosapa, but here I offer a start. But now I'm going to, I think, talk a little more extemporaneously about this topic. This is the drum that recently entered into the collection of John Stewart and will be featuring in publications and exhibitions here at the Gilcrease in the future. This is a hand drum made of hide, stretched around a wooden frame, and with buffalo horns nailed to the exterior. And the image, I'm going to try to find out how this pointer works now. The image in the center, of course, is this marvelous buffalo head you see here with horns, the ruff of his scalp, his ears on either side, his horns paralleling the arched horns on the drum itself, the two-sided drum. And then most distinctively, the breath of the buffalo that's extending from his mouth down to the bottom radius of the drum. On one side is a silhouette of a buffalo hoof. On the other side, either a spider or perhaps a woodpeck over here. These kinds of symbols are very much a part of the cultural repertoire that Richard West spoke about this morning. That is, a artistic form and artistic ideas that are very much rooted in the ideology of cultural production, in the sense that these are shared ideas that many understand and many can read. I'm not going to talk so much about the iconography of these symbols. What I want to turn to more is the idea that culture is expressed largely by individuals who interpret that cultural inventory of ideas and ideologies to create unique objects, to kind of make sense out of that cultural reality for themselves in a particular time and place in history. So that it is people who make culture as much as culture shapes people. And without understanding who the individuals are, their artists, sometimes objects such as this become kind of lost in a larger kind of understanding of culture in a broad sense. I first became aware of this drum when it belonged to a collector named Dennis Lassard, a marvelous collector, scholar, no longer living, who I learned from a great deal. He had it in his possession, some 20 years ago. And he wrote to another good friend and colleague of mine named Richard Port, who I worked with when I was in Detroit, inquiring whether or not this drum, with its elaborately painted surface, this hand drum, might be related to this drum, which was owned by Richard Port at that time, and was eventually given by him in 1997 to the Detroit Institute of Arts, where it is today. The relationship with these two drums, for me, goes back many, many years. I'd always, of course, this drum that you're seeing here in the Detroit Institute of Arts collection is quite famous for those of us who are interested in plains art. It was featured in the landmark exhibition in New York City at the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1972 as a great sort of icon of Plain's visionary expression, but with no idea actually of who made it. Richard Port had acquired it from a man named Burton Parker, who was living in Pontiac, Michigan at the time. And he said it descended through his family. And I discovered later that his grandfather, also named Burton Parker, was an agent at the Fort Peck Agency for 1 year in 1885. And that there was a small collection that Burton Parker Sr., the grandfather, had brought back and then kind of descended through the family. Richard Port acquired that collection from living Burton Parker, the grandson, and eventually, as I said, it was acquired by the Detroit Institute of Arts. But we know it comes from, by that history, it comes from the Fort Peck Agency in Montana in 1885, that year that Burton Parker, the grandfather, was there. Burton Parker, actually, the grandfather, was a fairly famous individual in Michigan. He had been the mayor of Monroe, Michigan, which is just downriver from Detroit. He was a Michigan senator. And then in reward for his service to his party, he was given this opportunity to be the Indian agent at Fort Peck. And why would that be an attractive proposition? Well, because of the opportunities for graft, frankly, and to line one's pockets. We'll talk a little bit more about what he found there, but what happened is that in 1880, the following year, he was there 1 year, and then the administration in Washington changed. The new party came into place, and he lost his job. So he returned to Michigan with this drum and several other objects. Now, Fort Peck in 1885, you have to understand kind of where we are and what was happening there. Here's a map, of course, of the West. Actually, this is great. We just followed Dr. King's talk, and we're kind of familiar with this geography and something of this history. Here's the Missouri River, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming. So what had been happening, Fort Peck, we know, was inhabited, a pretty popular river by, it was the agency for the Yanktonai and Assiniboine Indians of the northern plains. The Yanktonai in particular are a Dakota-speaking group whose earlier history had them located further downriver in South Dakota and Minnesota. But after the wars of the 1860s, many Yanktonai and Dakota fled Minnesota and traveled up the north, staying on the north side of the Missouri River. What they were following were these diminishing herds of buffalo, which were congregating around the Milk River region. So actually many tribes. And the annual migration that Dr. King was talking about earlier were the agency Indians of the Lakota, who had to travel up to this area during 1776 to hunt the remaining buffalo that were located there. And of course, we heard earlier this morning before lunch about the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. Sitting Bull and his Hunt Papa band end up fleeing the United States and seeking refuge in Canada shortly after the battle. Just 2 years later, the Upper Yanktonai, who are up there in that same location, very closely related to the Hunt Papa, and many also perhaps participated in the battle, settled at the newly formed Fort Peck Agency right here on the confluence of the Poplar River and the Missouri River. We know from historical accounts, and there's really a marvelous more recent history by Dennis Smith of the Fort Peck Reservation, that the years between 1778, the founding of the agency, and 1888 were particularly difficult. Smith refers to these as the starving years. The agency was ill-provisioned and mismanaged. There are food riots, hundreds starved during the winter, during heavy snowfalls. It was a very difficult place and a dangerous place to live during this period. This actually photograph probably shows us a slightly happier time. The drum that was collected at Fort Peck in 1885 at the Detroit Institute of Arts over here we've known for a long time is also closely linked to this drum, which is now in the National Museum of the American Indian collection. So I got a chance to become more acquainted with it. Both drums are made with a frame of wooden frame, square frame, with a hide that's kind of wrapped around it and stitched up at 3 edges, so folded under the bottom, and then painted. The drum at the Detroit Institute of Arts has this very eerie figure with this kind of oval-shaped head, these wings on either side rising from the bottom of the drum, these wavy lines that look like sort of spirit power, one in green, one in red, and then these balls of power that are tethered to the wings, hovering overhead, and then the figure's wearing this very thin, horned headdress, or has horns. The National Museum of the American Indian drum is made almost in an identical way with a square frame, with the hide laced around 3 edges. You can see the relationship between the shapes of the heads here, and particularly these staring red eyes. But here, instead of, this might be a thunderer or a thunderbird with this kind of transformation into a more human form with this face. Here we see the face in yellow of a buffalo, again with that ruff of hair on the forehead between the horns. And then, like the John Stewart drum we were just looking at, has these buffalo horns actually attached, tacked to the side. We know that this drum from the National Museum of the American Indian was collected by Elijah Slocum, who was an employee of the Adams Express Company, who had his office was located in Bismarck, North Dakota, and I've been able to determine that he was there between 1872 and 1877. A little bit more about him later. Referring to the Detroit drum, of course, one of the interesting things is that the Detroit drum has this very kind of whitish blue background and much darker colors, more solid colors than the National Museum of the American Indian drum. And you can even see that there are these traces of the circles, one kind of blue and red over here, and then you can just trace them over here in a much more faint pigment. But certainly the articulation of these symbols is quite different from one drum to the next, and so how to explain that? Well, began to look at, when this drum was published in the catalog of the Whitney Art Museum, Whitney Museum of American Art exhibition back in the 70s, Norman Fader, no less, who was the curator of that exhibition, suspected that this drum had been repainted in some way or another. So given that clue, I took it down when I was in Detroit, took it to the conservation lab and had some photographs done. And sure enough, this is an X-ray. We're looking right through most of the drum, but the X-rays cannot penetrate this background pigment, which it turns out is a white lead-based pigment, the kinds of things you warn people not to let their babies eat. But of course, the lead is impervious to X-rays. It's what you wear when you're at the dentist office when you're having your teeth X-rayed. So this is a modern or commercial pigment, like a house paint, and had been painted around the sides. You can see actually when you look at the bottom of the drum, you can see that the original, where the paint's been splashed over the sides and there's kind of underlying lighter color, looks like the black has also been reinforced with a lead paint. You can see that down here, our conservators are able to identify this as like kind of a charcoal gray, bone black is often called, which is an organic pigment. So sure enough, it looks like it's been heavily repainted. So what's going on with that? Well, here I have to resort to a little bit of oral tradition. As it turns out, when Richard Port owned the drum and he talked to the owner, the grandson of Burton Parker, Burton Parker, the grandson, he lived with his grandfather in Texas in 1900. They're both in the same census at that time. And Burton Parker, the grandson, told Richard Port that, well, when I was a kid, I used to use this drum as a piggy bank. So he cut a hole here in the upper corner. As you can see, I can get this thing to work again, here, where he could put his quarters in, or his pennies in, and he cut a slit in the back where he could get them out. And you can see from the detail here how, so we suspect that actually Burton Parker, the kid, when he was a child, is the one who kind of doctored up the drum and added the additional paint. We can only be thankful that it looks like, according to the x-rays, he's really good at coloring inside the lines. Of course, the National Museum of the American Indian drum is in far better condition in that regard, although both are quite striking. This drum also has a long history of being celebrated as a great icon and masterpiece of Plains Indian painting, again, with no real understanding of who made it. It was featured as the kind of poster object for the famous exhibition, one of the early exhibitions of the National Museum of the American Indian in the George Gustav Eye Center, Echoes of the Drum. This is the drum they're talking about. It has a kind of interesting history. The letter of donation from Edith Story Gray, she is the kind of niece of the donor, describes, you can see it reproduced here, the collection that she gave is the Indian regalia was the personal property of Chief Sitting Bull, warrior of the Sioux Nation in the Black Hills of North Dakota. Her uncle, Elisha Slocum, when he was a young man, worked at the Adams Express Company. Adams Express Company was kind of like American Express, it comes out of the same thing. It was a company that began in the gold fields of California in 1849 when, those who are pursuing mining out there or prospecting needed to send cash back to the east. So what they would do is they take your gold and then they'd end up, sending cash back to your relatives. So there were, Adams Express companies were located at railheads and other sort of the ends of the expanding commercial empire of the United States, including the plains. She also mentions in this letter that that the collection was acquired from Sitting Bull by somebody she calls Captain John Crawford, who she claims is the Indian agent for the Sioux Indians. Now, we'll get into that in a bit. It turns out that the Captain Jack Crawford is best known as the cowboy poet of the Black Hills. He was an early prospect. He was a colleague of Buffalo Bill, who also performed in Wild West shows. But his main notoriety is he was part of a group of prospectors who illegally entered into the Black Hills in the years after the Fort Laramie Treaty that Dr. King talked about earlier, and that finding gold inspired the government to send no less than George Armstrong Custer into the Black Hills with a large expedition to look for gold there in 1874. So Captain Jack Crawford, he was temporarily the mayor of Custer City here in the Black Hills. We know that Elisha Slocum was up here at the Bismarck, North Dakota. This is where the Northern Pacific Railroad had been undergoing construction, but there was a kind of economic crash at that time. They went bankrupt, and construction here stalled at the bridge that was to cross the Missouri River. That's where we suspect Elisha Slocum was stationed. Fort Peck, if there was a relationship with the Fort Peck drum we looked at earlier, is quite a distance away. So it's plausible, I suppose, that somehow these all came together, that Jack Crawford was the source of the collection. But also possibly Edith Story Gray was listening to the stories of her uncle Elijah and somehow got all these stories confused into this Sitting Bull, Captain Jack Crawford, and so on. Certainly when we look at the collection that Edith Story Gray donated to the National Museum of the American Indian, including the drum, it's an interesting kind of assortment of different kinds of objects. Here's a drum over here, of course. But here's a Blackfeet pierced shirt that comes from northern Montana, pairs of leggings, a Blackfeet blanket strip. These are probably Yanktonai leggings and Lakota moccasins here, all from the northern plains, all to that period, but no specific tribe, and certainly very unlikely to be any regalia belonging to Sitting Bull. And how did Jack Crawford become in contact with Sitting Bull at that time is a kind of a mystery as well. So we believe the provenance, the Sitting Bull provenance, is unreliable, but nevertheless, because of that provenance, the National Museum of the American Indian drum is often referred to in literature. You'll see it as Sitting Bull's drum. And it makes, some visual sense here. Sitting Bull, Buffalo Bull, he's got buffalo horns, there's a buffalo image on it. It's a very satisfying kind of explanation. but I'm afraid it's totally inaccurate. So, returning to our map, interesting things were happening, certainly after the battle, around the Fort Peck area. Beginning around 1879 through 1881, the Hunkpapa, who were in exile in Canada, slowly began drifting back across the border and reconnecting with their friends and relations, Yanktonai and others at the Fort Peck Agency. As a result of that, the 11th Cavalry, which is stationed down at Fort Custer on the Powder River, was dispatched up to Fort Peck to kind of intercept and surrendering Hunkpapa. And so the 11th Cavalry under Captain Ogden Reed and putting in Henry Highstand, which we'll talk about in just a moment, they go and they're stationed at Fort Peck Agency between 1880 and 1884 up here. Now, an interesting, one of the officers, Lieutenant Ogden Reed, also collects a number of objects at the Fort Peck Agency during this period, and includes some very significant objects. Again, these are Gaul surrenders at that time, and there's a small skirmish with the troops and Gaul's Hunkpapa. So these are objects that are captured in battle or surrendered by individuals or sold because of on the occasion of the surrender in an attempt to try to really just survive. But there are an assortment of different kinds of objects, including these moccasins that belong to one of the ranking Yanktonai chiefs, who's named Medicine Bear. Some beautiful beaded objects that are made in years before and have been prized personal possessions, but then are sold to Ogden Reed and others. Objects like this on the occasion of their surrender. And this is a small buffalo horn cup with some beadwork on it that Ogden Reed identifies. And he donated his collection to the University of Vermont and sent with it a detailed inventory where he identifies many of these things by name and by who they were collected from. This was collected from a man he identifies as Black Prairie Chicken as a series of ritual objects. Interestingly enough, among those objects that Reed identifies as having been purchased from Black Prairie Chicken, which translates as Sayosapa, is a medicine drum and rattle purchased from Black Chicken in Yanktonai at Poplar River in Montana, 1882. And he identifies him as the principal medicine man of the Yanktonai tribe. This is a drum. It's a little bit, it has this additional handle. It's a hand drum, but it has this same kind of oval-shaped face with the staring eyes and these dots, which might be hailstones or stars, but a common artistic convention of the Yanktonai and other Plains tribes at that time. So there's the first historical mention of this individual we know as Sayosapa, or Black Prairie Chicken, the creator of ritual equipment such as drums and buffalo horns and that kind of thing. Sayosapa also turns up in the memoirs or the literature of a woman who was the army wife of Lieutenant Henry Highstand. And he was, along with Ogden Reed, posted at Poplar River between 1880 and 1884. Much later in her life, she publishes in a kind of military journal, a periodical for military people in the 1920s, what she refers to as scraps from an Army woman's diary. She accompanied her husband on all of his campaigns, cooked for him, kept house. This was common for officers, wives of officers like Libby Custer, who often joined her husband in the field. But she had these interesting anecdotes, and she identifies this individual we call many interesting characters in the Fort Peck Agency, Montana, was a medicine man named Sayosapa, Black Chicken, a tall, slim fellow of erect and dignified carriage. She also refers to his healing practice, which includes playing a drum over patients to cure their diseases or their illnesses, and it had other sorts of powers as well. So she has a little anecdote about Black Prairie Chicken or Sayosapa in her memoirs. And then, much later, a very prominent curator of the time, a man named Stuart Cullen, who worked for the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Ethnography and later was the curator of the Brooklyn Museum. He traveled during the summer and collecting expeditions and kept detailed journals. Few of them are published. And on the summer of 1900, he travels to Fort Peck and he meets Dr. Black Chicken, who proved to be the far most intelligent and industrious and capable Indian I met on the reservation. Interestingly enough, we'll return to this at the end of my talk, Hewlin identifies him as a hunk papa, a renegade from Sitting Bull's band, and had lived at Fort Peck for the last 28 years. And I had a hard time kind of reconciling, Ivan Reed, on one hand, was identifying him as the most prominent doctor among the Yanktonai tribe, and then Hewlin's refers to him as a hunk papa. We'll get into that a little bit later, but it's kind of a mystery. He collected, he met Sayosapa in 1900, which we know is about 2 years before he died. He collected from him a number of ritual objects, including his stone medicine. Uwepi doctors are also known as stone doctors. They use stones, raw stones are some of the most important ritual equipment. They use them for healing, for looking into the future, for finding lost objects. Hewlin describes a ritual in which Sayosapa would look for and find lost horses by putting a drum underneath a miniature teepee and then listening while the drum played itself beneath the teepee. And then when they opened it up, there was horse dung in the teepee. So he was believed to have these miraculous powers, which were characteristic for Uwepi doctors of the Lakota, Nakota, and the Northern Plains. Hewlin collected his stone medicine and several other objects, which he sent back to Philadelphia for the University of Pennsylvania Museum, which they promptly exchanged with the Berlin Museum, and now they're over in Germany. But they're illustrated here. You can see right here. When a person was very sick, Hewlin reported his death was anticipated. Sayosapa painted 2 smaller stones. He called these the large and small doctor. And here is Mr. Hewlin himself. And then Sayosapa continues to have encounters with officials and other important outsiders who visit the Fort Peck agency. Hewlin and Ogden Reed kind of bracket his career, but in the meantime, a military officer named Captain Lloyd Wheaton of the 20th Infantry was stationed there between the years 1886 and 1894. Wheaton later became well known as one of the generals in charge of the Philippine campaign during the Spanish-American War. But he collected for and donated to the Chicago Historical Museum a pair of painted muslins, kind of like the ones that we're looking at this morning, Dr. King was talking about with White Swan. Here's a detail of one. And he identifies it explicitly. These muslins were painted by Black Chicken, a Sioux chief of the Oglala tribe. Now we've got Yanktonai, Hunkpapa, and Oglala. But these kinds of muslin paintings have a very distinctive kind of appearance and style. Here are 2 of them. One at the National Museum of the American Indian here on the left-hand side here, and then at the National Museum of Natural History on the right-hand side. The great and late American Indian anthropologist, scholar of American Indian art, Jack Ewers, was very interested in these muslins, and first established Sayosapa's authorship of the muslins without necessarily knowing anything about the drums. And as I say, they're quite distinctive. Here's the National Museum of the American Indian, the National Museum of Natural History muslin. You can see it's divided into a number of episodes, and he tends to repeat the same scenes over and over and over again. And I've identified now dozens of these, where often he has Lakota or Sioux or Yanktonai fighting crows, as you see here, or hunting buffalo, or also images of the Sundance. You see the Sundance Lodge, the Sundance pole in the center, and the individuals inside who are praying. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But this is a distinctive style that Jack Ewers was able to identify with Sayosapa. Then at the National Museum of Natural History, there's also another drum, much more sort of closely related to the John Stewart drum. Here it is a photograph in storage. You can see it's a circular drum in this case with buffalo horns tacked to the outer surface. And this image of the buffalo head here in the center. But some wag, I don't know why, added these eyebrows and a little passer's nose and a little mouth down here. And so I had to, when I redrew it, you can see kind of without those details, you can see how this relates to the earlier images of buffalo we were looking at. And notice also the zigzag lines of the buffalo breath and these two balls that hover on either side related to the image we were seeing earlier on. And then the dots, which either stars or hailstones. Inscribed on the drum itself is this inscription that is writing, Dr. Black Chicken, Medicine Man, Fort Peck, Montana, presented by F.A. Hunter. F.A. Hunter, I discovered, was a clerk at the Fort Peck Agency who was stationed there between 1892 and 1897 until he was removed for civil service infractions. He was actually politicking or advocating or working for the politics of for the election of an official, and as those of us who work for the federal government know that you can't do that. And actually, Clark ended up, Hunter lost his job, but he's like the second highest paid official at the agency. So, and evidently, Sayosapa was able to sell him a drum. And then now we have the drums that the former Dennis Lassard drum that we looked at earlier, now here in Tulsa. And then there's another drum at the Montana Historical Museum. Again, no collection history here, but it has the same buffalo head, the kind of ruff of hair between the horns, the ears, the buffalo breath, looking kind of like a beard. So I think these are, and this kind of crescent halo around it. These drums are closely related. Also notice the buffalo horns. I think these are probably also made by Sayosapa. And then the final group of drums I've been able to locate are actually, strangely enough, at the Carlisle Indian School, which is in Pennsylvania. Now it's a Dickinson, known as the Carlisle Indian School is one of the first, was the first federal Indian school, boarding school, originated by an officer named Pratt. Indian children were sent there and could be transformed into citizens of the United States. But they have a small collection of things that their students brought with them, probably to sell as part of their upkeep or to raise cash, which includes a group of objects that I think were also made by Sayosapa. There are two drums, and notice one is a kind of a replica of the Detroit Institute of Art's drum, but instead of having the blue or the white painted lead background that was provided by Burton Parker, here you see it's red, but has the same winged creature with the horns. And then there's also a buffalo drum, so they tend to come in pairs. This is the buffalo now with a pair of kind of standing buffalo figures who are holding pipes. You can see their kind of woolly bodies and their horns, their faces kind of buffalo men. And there is also muslin with a very characteristic Sayosapa version of the Sundance, with the Sundance pole in the center and the dancers arranged around the side. So when we add up all the drums, those with provenance, those we can date, those without, they kind of end up in an arrangement like this. The earliest one, of course, in terms of collection history, is the National Museum of American Indian drum, collected in 1887. Then there's the drum that was collected by the officer Ogden Reed in 1882, sent back to Vermont. There is the drum in Detroit Institute of Arts, which was collected by the Indian agent, sold to the Indian agent Burton Parker in 1885. There's the drum that was sold to the clerk at Fort Peck, Hunter, between the years when he was stationed there, 1892 to 1897. And then these drums with a more foggy provenance. And then finally this group of drums from the Trout Museum, the old Carlisle Indian School, and I've been able to identify them as dating or going to that collection between 1891 and 1896 for reasons I'll get into in a moment. But first let's talk a little bit more about Sayosapa's identity. When we go to the Indian census, he first appears, and these are documents that were prepared every year by the agency employees to determine who was going to get fed, essentially. Who would be included in the rolls and who would be recognized as part of under the care of that agency. So they're handwritten documents where people would come in and have their names recorded, their Indian name on one hand, the translation of their name in English, a family relation, sex, and then an estimation of age. Sayosapa appears on the Fort Peck rolls for the first time in 1885. Here he is, black chicken. He's a father, and he has a son and 2 daughters, and they're here. And then the last entry in the rolls, he appears every year. I was able to look at every one of them. And this used to be a huge chore. These records in paper form were at archives. You have to go visit. They're not alphabetical. You have to kind of plow through them. But now, thanks to the digital age, they're available to anyone on Ancestor.com. You can go take a look. So I was able to look at all of them. And I can trace him through all the censuses from one year until he drops out. He no longer appears. 1902 is the last year he appears with his wife, Kanku, known as Good Road. And then the next year, Kanku and her children appear, and he does not. So that's why I suspect he passed away between the years 1902 and 1903. Now, the situation is complicated a little bit more by some unfortunate misunderstandings. When those who also interested in Sayosapa have kind of looked into him and tried to identify him in photographs, some misunderstandings have occurred. First, there's the Elijah Slocum story about the drum having belonged to Sitting Bull, and that leads to a Sayosapa, or black chicken, who was in fact closely associated with Sitting Bull. One of his lieutenants who was identified at the time of his surrender as one of his 20 chief lieutenants. Then they settled at Standing Rock. That Sayosapa also was involved with the assassination of Sitting Bull just during the ghost dance. He was one of the police officers who was assigned to arrest him. Here he is at that Sayosapa is right here next to. This is a photograph of Sitting Bull and his band's confinement at Fort Randall before they end up in Standing Rock, between 1881 and 1882. I believe this is White Bull, Sitting Bull's nephew, next to Sayosapa, who again was identified by Sitting Bull as one of his principal lieutenants. Wrong Sayosapa. Then there's this photograph, which was taken by Delancey Gill in Washington in 1905. This photograph was actually published by Jack Ewers in a publication where he discusses the muslins. This, of course, in 1905 is when 3 years after the Fort Peck Sayosapa has already passed away. And so going back to the rolls, we are able to identify actually 3 separate Sayosapas, 3 separate black chickens, all living simultaneously on different reservations at the same time. So here's the Indian census from the Fort Peck Agency, Sayosapa. Here's the Hunkpapa Indian census from Standing Rock in 1898, Sayosapa and his family. And in the Yankton Indian census, that's the guy who visited Washington in 1905, here's Sayosapa and his family. 3 Sayosapas, 3 different individuals. We only have photographs of 2 of them. I've never been able to find a photograph of the Fort Peck Sayosapa. Now, how did the drums get to, those things get to the Carlisle School? Now, unfortunately, as I say, Carlisle School is one of the earliest Indian schools. Many Lakota were sent there during the late 70s, during the 80s. And it was logical to think that maybe Sayosapa's eldest son, who is identified in the Indian rolls as Peter Chicken, may have attended the school. In fact, in the national census of 1900, he's indicated as going, he's not at the reservation, but the notation in the census, he's at school. Well, the Fort Peck students started attending school off reservation when the students at Fort Peck burned down their boarding school and protested their treatment there in I think it was, I'm sorry, I thought I had that date. So they start going off in about in the 1880s or so. But when I look into there are several scholars who are looking at records of who was attending the Carlisle School during those years. Peter Chicken never appears. Barbara Landis is doing a great deal of work, researcher, scholar, in determining who were the students who were attending at Carlisle. Here's, of course, a photograph of the Carlisle School here. So yeah, Fort Peck students attend after 1890 when the school is destroyed by arson. That's you burn it down. But what we do know, however, is that the translator of the encounter between Sayosapa and Stuart Hewlin in 1900 is a man named Joseph Culbertson, who is he's been at the Fort Peck for many, many years. He's mixed blood, well respected by the tribe, and he serves during Hewlin's visit as his translator and also basically his agent. Culbertson is the one who negotiates the deal for the sale of Black Chicken's, Sayosapa's ritual equipment. And we know that Joseph Culbertson's son attends Carlisle during the years 1891 to 1896. We've already, Joseph Culbertson also tells Stuart Hewlin that Sayosapa is the creator of curios, or different kinds of curiosities, objects that he's selling at the local fort. So Joseph Culbertson is acting essentially as Sayosapa's agent and helping to sell his creations to outsiders. And so we suspect that Joseph Culbertson's son, or Joseph Culbertson sent these objects with his son to help raise money for his son's travel and other expenses to the Carlisle School. That's how I feel we can date these drums to that period between 1891 and 1896 when Joseph Culbertson Jr. was attending. There are some other objects at the Carlisle School that are quite interesting. I've already mentioned the Sundance muslin, and then a kind of a model of a shield which shows the buffalo head and a thunderbird or an eagle, as you see here. And you notice with the drums, they tend to fall into two different kinds: the image of the winged creature with horns or the buffalo head. And these are the kinds of kind of spiritual knowledge, or stem from the kind of spiritual knowledge that Sayosapa received when he was younger, when he was training to become a UB doctor, probably under the tutelage of an elder doctor, but also on the basis of his own personal visions, where somehow the thunderbird or the eagle and the buffalo interact in such a way that creates this distinctive style of drum, this distinctive kind of way of representing his spiritual and esoteric knowledge on these kinds of objects, which he used in his rituals, but then evidently started to create replicas along with the muslins that he would sell to outsiders. He clearly is a man of great spiritual knowledge. There are these very interesting and unique representations of the sun dance. Here I have details of two muslins. I want you to notice in particular the buffalo heads that you see here with their breath that are very much like the images we see on the shields. And then these interesting square objects on both that resemble very much the drums we've talked about. So here are the two earliest drums, very likely the drums that stemming from his original practice as a weeby doctor that he may have surrendered rather reluctantly, but then began to reproduce in additional drums for sale to outsiders, to agents, to military officers, as we've seen. That they work as a pair, the buffalo head with the winged creature, as we see, and this is a detail of the muslin itself, the buffalo head with its breath, and then looks like an image of a drum with four eagle feathers on each corner, and then the head of the horned creature here, horned figure here in the center. So in the whole scheme of things, again, these drums, they stem from original vision, part of his training as a healer and as a doctor, part of his practice, but then over the years confined to the Fort Peck, his practice outlawed by the Court of Indian Offenses, as identified by Hewlin. He sells his ritual equipment, begins to develop, reinvent himself as an artist, the creator of muslins, and the creator also of replicas of his earlier ritual equipment. Drums such as these, the one that was he may have used or may have been made for sale, but based upon that original vision and based upon the earlier drums. The hunter drum here or the drum now here in Tulsa. I think these are the most closely related in terms of form and probably also date as well. But I want to return, and I'm just going to read my conclusion here, because to this issue of Sayosapa's ethnic identity. Who was he really? So let us return to that question. His works have been attributed to a variety of different cultures, contributing to considerable confusion as to how to interpret and understand them. Identifying him as their author helps considerably, but there remains the problem of his and probably his history, but there remains the problem of his historically contingent cultural identity. He was enrolled at Poplar River as a Yanktonai and identified as such by the first official in 1880 to document his name, Captain Ogden B. Reed. But then why was Stuart Cullen so definite in 1900 about referring to him as a Hunkpapa renegade of Sitting Bull's band? At first I thought that Cullen was probably confusing him with a Standing Rock, Sayosapa, one of Sitting Bull's lieutenants, as we talked about earlier. But Cullen was a professional ethnographer, and he interviewed Sayosapa with the help of a translator, Joseph Culbertson, a mixed blood trader and a translator who had undoubtedly known Sayosapa for decades. He is also definite about Sayosapa's having lived with the Poplar River community for 28 years, a curiously specific number. The statement made at the time of the interview in 1900 refers to the date 1872, which, as it turns out, was an eventful year. In 1872, a delegation of Yanktonai chiefs traveled to Washington, D.C., and returned to the old Fort Peck location, a little further upriver from Poplar River, having negotiated the right to establish their agency there. The Yanktonai convened at the old trading post with a large contingent of Hunkpapa. Raymond Damali, the famous Lakota scholar, who wrote about this episode in detail, describes a curious situation where the Yanktonai camped on the north side of the river, Missouri River, at the agency, while the Hunkpapa with Sitting Bull were camped in the south bank. Many of the Hunkpapa leadership attempted to dissuade their people from crossing the river and becoming ostensibly agency Indians, but many did anyway, enticed presumably by the weariness of war, hunger, and the promise of provisions and support. Was Sayosapa one of those Hunkpapa who chose the agency? As I mentioned, or I should say that the agency moved to its current location, the Poplar River, 6 years later. When Captain Reed arrived with the 11th Infantry in 1880, he was ordered to arrest Hunkpapa, those that had remained with Sitting Bull in 1872 and fought at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 and fled to Canada, but in 1880 were quietly returning. If Sayosapa had indeed crossed over in 1872, he had every reason to conceal his Hunkpapa origins from Captain Reed in 1880. He had been part of the Yankton community, the head man of the Yanktonai, head medicine man of the Yanktonai, as we put it, for 8 years by then, and surely regarded himself as part of their community, with whom he remained until his death in 1902 or 1903. This hypothetical yet very plausible scenario reminds us of what we already know, the multi-ethnic nature of many Native communities, and the permeability of their cultural identities. Individuals make choices about who they will be based upon the circumstances they experience. And Sayosapa seems to have been particularly adept at shifting his identity to serve his best interest, his best interests, as the transformation from a UWB doctor to an artist attests. His example reinforces for us as historians that cultural identities are contingent upon such circumstances, and that the administrative requirement of Indian agencies to fix the identities of enrollees in place can sometimes contribute to a false sense of tidiness in the historical record. All this plays back to my original point, that when objects are considered solely as cultural productions, we can lose the human dimension and a large measure of the truth of the very human experiences from which they originate and to whom they are bound. Thank you.